We have seen what servitude is only in relation to lordship, but it is a self-consciousness, and we have now to consider what as such it is in and for itself. To begin with, servitude has the Lord for its essential reality. Hence, the truth for it is the independent consciousness that is for itself. However, servitude is not yet aware that this truth is implicit in it, but it does in fact contain within itself this truth of pure negativity and being for self, for it has experienced this its own essential nature. For this consciousness has been fearful, not of this or that particular thing, or just at odd moments, but its whole being has been seized with dread, for it has experienced the fear of death, the absolute Lord. In that experience, it has been quite unmanned, has trembled in every fiber of its being, and everything solid and stable has been shaken to its foundations. But this pure universal moment, this absolute melting away of everything stable, is the simple essential nature of self-consciousness, absolute negativity, pure being for self, which consequently is implicit in this consciousness. This moment of pure being for self is also explicit for the bondsman, for in the Lord it exists for him as his object. Furthermore, his consciousness is not this dissolution of everything stable merely in principle. In his service, he actually brings this about. Through his service, he rids himself of his attachment to natural existence in every single detail, and gets rid of it by working on it. As we arrive now at paragraph 194, we have crossed an important threshold. The master was seen as the locus of initiative, where the dialectical development was going on, in part because the master would impose a condition upon the slave. The master is the independent consciousness, the slave is, as we've seen, the dependent consciousness. The slave does what he or she does at the will of the master, who requires the slave to engage with the entire world of objects and to provide the master what self-consciousness has wanted, what it's had desire for in this entire range of objects, but was unable to achieve. There's a double connection there that we just saw, right? The master is related to the slave in terms of desire and in terms of agency, in terms of power, and the master is related to the things that the slave works upon. The slave engages with, as Hegel says, their independent aspect, and the slave delivers to the master through the work, as a product of the work, enjoyment of the dependent aspect of things. So it looks like the master is doing pretty good for him or herself. But from this point on, the initiative shifts wholly to the side of the slave. So Hegel is going to ask us to consider a fundamental question. What is the slave, or servitude, if we want to understand this in more generic terms, in and for itself? Is it merely a power relation where one person is subjugated to another and their labor is being exploited in however way we want to think of that? Or is there something more important going on? And it's really a trick question, as we're going to see in this section, because this is not an automatic process. And as a matter of fact, nothing within the dialectic that affects human beings is an automatic process where you just plop human beings into a certain matrix of relations and they just sort of automatically unfold in a certain way. It does involve human initiative. It does involve human choice. It does involve what Hegel calls passion. And in this case, it also involves certain affects and certain, what we might say, certain decisions. Or certain experiences. So in this case, what we're going to find is that the slave does have a capacity of developing beyond where the master is if the slave undergoes a certain primal experience in that case. If that doesn't happen, then the slave remains moored in its own individuality. What's really going on is the slave is losing his or her individuality as a person, and something else is coming in its place, precisely because what is universal for human beings is, I don't want to say a lack of individuality, but something transcending that. So let's see how he plays this out. There's a beautiful section here. He says, We've seen what servitude is only in relation to lordship, right? It's a relationship of being subjugated to another, working for them, having your work exploited. He says, but it is a self-consciousness. Now we have to consider what it is, what as such it is in and for itself. What as a self-consciousness, the person who is engaged in the one-down position, the person who is the slave, the servant, the bondsman, however you want to translate it, what is going on with them as a self-consciousness. So he says, to begin with, servitude has the Lord for its essential reality. Hence, the truth for it is the independent consciousness that is for itself. The master gets to be for him or herself precisely, as we saw, through the mediation of the slave and through what the slave is mediating, which is the world of objects, the world of worked upon artifacts that the master gets to enjoy. So it looks as if the master is really the one who has this for itself relation. Things are pretty great for them. Of course, they will have to die and they get sick and they, run into all sorts of other problems just like everyone else in the human condition. But it looks like it's pretty good for them because they get to tell other people what to do. But this is only an appearance. The master will not develop further. The slave will. So he says, servitude is not yet aware that this truth, what truth? The truth that it thinks is in the master is actually in the slave. Before we said that the slave is a slave for the master, but really what's going on is the master is a master for the slave. There's an ontological dependence of mastery here as well. So he says, servitude is not aware this truth is implicit in it. How is it going to become aware of that implicit truth? It does in fact contain within itself this truth of pure negativity and being for self, this relation of reflexivity, of being able to take a stand upon itself, of being able to dissociate itself from, say, its natural environment or its own desires or its even will to live. All of that has got it stuck in slavery originally, but slavery can't hold the slave there. He says, it's experienced its own essential nature. How? How did it experience its own essential nature? Well, that's where these things come in. Through anxiety or dread, Angst in German. And we don't necessarily need to read here a Kierkegaardian or a Heideggerian or Sartrean discussion of anxiety. But we also shouldn't just translate this as something just like pain, right? It is, in fact, a kind of fear, as we're going to see, but a fear that goes beyond just one mere object of fear. There's also, as Hegel says, fear itself, Furcht, of death. And so, how does this play itself out? He says, this consciousness has been fearful, not of this or that particular thing, or just at odd moments. So the anxiety or the dread is a affect that runs throughout, it permeates their existence, their day-to-day life. And it's not just about this or that thing, like the master getting angry and then beating you or taking away some privileges or making you do more work or separating you from your friends or what leisure time that you have. There's more going on there. There's a fear that becomes part of, in a certain respect, it becomes part of the person, but in a certain respect, it also becomes the way that person experiences their environment. So it becomes something that lies between the person and their environment. So they feel this fear, this anxiety. They are fearful. They are anxious. And he says it is experienced what? What centers this anxiety? The fear of death. And the fear of death is not actually a fear of the determinate master, the person who does in fact probably hold power of life and death over you. It is a fear of the absolute master, the master beyond the master, to whom even these lowercase masters are subject, because all of them must die. This is part of what it means to be a finite consciousness. And the slave is much more conscious of it than the master, who can find all sorts of soporifics to sort of keep it at bay, or make all sorts of attempts, drawing on the energies of others to forestall that for a while. The slave is, so to speak, exposed to death in a way that the master is not. So he says, it has experienced the fear of death, the absolute master. In that experience, it has been quite unmanned, has trembled in every fiber of its being. There is no part of the person that was reserved, that could stand back, that did not feel, that was not colored by this fear. And now we can say, well, where did this actually happen? Did this happen in the battle to the death? Yes, that happened in the battle to the death, but it also continues to happen in this person's existence, because that is part of what goes along with the condition of servitude, the condition of dependence, the condition of vulnerability to the desires and the will of another, and the violence of another. So he says, everything solid and stable has been shaken to its foundations. That's an important thing to consider. What does it mean to say that it has been shaken to its foundations? Everything that appears to be reliable, that really comes from the world of the master, or the world view projected out by the master, the slave sees through. The slave sees that even if they do appease the master, even if they do work on products, they can die. They can lose their life at any moment. And going even further than that, as a class, the slaves see that this is what can happen to any of them. So if they form relations with each other, those relations can be destroyed. There is nothing that they can count upon. There's nothing to which they can make appeal. So he says, what's going on here? This pure universal moment that came about because of this fear at the very core of the being of the slave. As the slave is developing, as the slave is suffering, he says, this universal moment, this melting away of everything stable, is the simple, essential nature of self-consciousness. That is at the core of our existence as self-conscious beings, as containing that relation of reflexivity that allows us to be what we are, the kind of beings that we are, and to be the kinds of beings that would be involved in a phenomenological development, that would have a history. We can go on and on and on. That is what it means for Hegel. That's, remember back to the preface, the power of the negative. This is also the patience and the labor of the negative that's going on as well. So he says, absolute negativity, pure being for self, is implicit in this consciousness. How does this become explicit? He says, the moment of pure being for self becomes explicit for the bondsman. In the Lord, it exists for him as his object. We think of the Lord as being the subject, but now the slave is really the subject, the agent, the one who is getting things done, who is having experiences, who is developing. And the Lord, or the master, becomes an object that provokes fear, but an object that also requires things, an object that is also a self-consciousness. So he says, his consciousness is not this dissolution of everything stable merely in principle. How does this really occur, this dissolution? Does it happen just with feeling fear? No. Here's where we get an even more important notion. That of service, dienen, literally service of the Lord, service in the service of the Lord, the master. And he says, in his service, he actually brings this about. So what the fear revealed to him in the day-to-day ongoing labor on the world of things and giving those goods to the master, because of that fear, because of the condition that the slave is in, the slave comes to know what his or her condition really is. It's not enough to fear at one moment. There has to be this ongoing process of work in order to make this truly actual or explicit. So he says, through this service, he rids himself of his attachment to natural existence in every single detail and gets rid of it by working on it. The slave is forced into conditions that they would not themselves choose if it was up to them. And so because they are forced into these conditions and have to work upon not only the objects of their labor, but work upon themselves and work upon their relation to the master, they continue to develop. However, the feeling of absolute power, both in general and in the particular form of service, is only implicitly this dissolution. And although the fear of the Lord is indeed the beginning of wisdom, consciousness is not therein aware that it is a being for self. Through work, however, the bondsman becomes conscious of what he truly is. In the moment which corresponds to desire in the Lord's consciousness, it did seem that the aspect of unessential relation to the thing fell to the lot of the bondsman, since in that relation the thing had retained its independence. Desire has reserved to itself the pure negating of the object and thereby its unalloyed feeling of self. But that is the reason why this satisfaction is itself only a fleeting one, for it lacks the side of objectivity and permanence. Work, on the other hand, is desire held in check, fleetingness staved off, or in other words, work forms and shapes the thing. The negative relation to the object becomes its form and something permanent because it is precisely for the worker that the object has independence. This negative middle term, or the formative activity, is at the same time the individuality, or pure being for self, of consciousness, which now in the work outside of it acquires an element of permanence. It is in this way, therefore, that consciousness, qua worker, comes to see in the independent being of the object its own independence. In section 195, Hegel is now elaborating the way in which all these things that we've seen are an important part of human consciousness, like desire, how they come together in the development of what he's going to call objectivity and permanence, not on the side of the master or even of the relation between the master and the slave, but rather between the slave and the object, the thing, in the world of work. And you notice that we've got, again, this sort of relationship of mediation, where the master is the one who puts the slave to work upon the thing, and the master is going to get the dependent aspect of the thing, which is going to be the nice stuff, right? The meat, the kernel, and the slave is going to work upon everything else and not really derive anything from it. So Hegel will say, what we saw in the last paragraph, the feeling of absolute power both in general and in the particular form of service, right? This fear that the slave feels both in relation to the determinate master and the absolute master of death, and the service that the slave is compelled to spend its time, its labor, its life upon, shaping not only the object in the process, but shaping itself in the process. He says this is only implicitly this dissolution, this breakdown of the person, but it's going to also be the beginning of the renewal of the person as well. So he invokes a biblical passage that I think we're all familiar with. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Not the fear of God in this case, but the fear of this particular master, the fear of the one who can discipline you, who can hurt you, who can take things away from you, who can make you do things, who can impose his or her will upon you. It says, consciousness is not therein aware that it is a being for self. So it's not as if just by having power exercised upon you, you automatically come to a greater awareness of yourself. That would indeed turn power into something desirable. But part of the reason why it's not desirable is because power and violence turned against people tends to deform them, tends to break them down. It just so happens that in some cases, this is going to produce a different kind of consciousness. Not merely a consciousness of dependency, by the way. So he says, through work, the bondsman become conscious of what he truly is. Or as we've translated it here, a little bit more closely to the German, through work, through Arbeit, through working upon things, and through having work to do, being a worker, the slave literally comes to his or her self. They come back to themselves. They find out what they truly are. They find out who they truly are. That they're not simply a what, but also a who. So he says, in the moment which corresponds to desire in the Lord's consciousness, it did seem that the aspect of unessential relation to the thing fell to the part of the bondsman. So what do we mean here? The master gets to satisfy his desires. We saw this in the previous passages, right? And desire is for a number of different things. One of these is to enjoy the, as we call it, dependent aspect, the good part of the thing that has to be worked upon. If it's a field, you need somebody to plow the field, then seed the field, then weed the field, then harvest the field, then take what they've harvested and store it and process it, and then finally it comes to you on a dinner plate. And if you're the master, you just sit there and you say, thanks, that's great. Glad that you put in all those hours of labor so I can have this bread. The master satisfies their desire vis-a-vis, in relation to, you could say, the entire world of things. Now, of course, if we're talking about primitive society, it's not like the master is satisfying a desire with respect to the same world of things that we are ourselves. I mean, think about what processed sugar would have been like if you'd taken it back to the ancient world, where honey tended to be one of the main sweeteners. People would have gone nuts for it, right? And people, in fact, did go nuts with it. As soon as it came on the market, you could sell a ton of that stuff. That's why commodities were so important, and they were such an important factor in human development and in what we call globalization. In part because it's the masters and even the servants who, insofar as they get to be masters over somebody else, Rousseau has a lot of great talk about this, insofar as they get to enjoy the world of things, coffee, cocoa, all these sorts of spices, all these sorts of things require a lot of labor. Somebody has to do that labor. So the master sets the slave to work. And here's what Hegel's saying. The master gets to satisfy his or her desire. The slave, by contrast, doesn't get to satisfy his or her desire, because they might like to have some of this to begin with. They also might not like to be put to work. That would be a desire on their part. But there's an even more important desire that hasn't been talked about here, of course, which is recognition. We saw that there in the exercise of power, as the master puts the slave to work, there is a one-sided recognition that is taking place where the slave recognizes the master as a person, as independent self-consciousness, but the slave himself or herself is not thereby recognized in the process. What's key is that the slave is actually going to come to a recognition of self in this. It's not like the world can actually recognize these people either. So recognition is also a key aspect of this desire as well. And Hegel will talk here about getting to enjoy the thing, but also getting to enjoy the feeling of self, getting to enjoy that one is what one is. And this is that desire for self-certainty. As we've seen, though, the master's desire for self-certainty can't really be satisfied to the degree that initially it was thought to be, because this entire realm over here is where truth is going to reside. In this case, truth is going to reside in terms of objectivity and permanence. So how do we get there? He says, desire reserved to it the pure negating of the object, and thereby its unalloyed feeling of self. But that is the reason why this satisfaction is itself only a fleeting one. It lacks the side of objectivity and permanence. Work is desire held in check, desire deferred, often indefinitely. Fleetingness staved off. When you're working, you can't have the world in entire flux, right? And you can't just be consuming things. if you're working, especially if you're working for somebody else, there better be more left, at the end of the process of work than you started with, or else there wasn't much point in doing the work at all. So the slave has to generate the world. The slave works upon the world, but the slave also builds a new world that is more, that has a surplus to it. So through work, this objectivity and permanence becomes something possible. It says, work forms and shapes the thing. So the thing is not just separated off into its dependent and independent aspect. You might say that the person who truly knows the thing is the servant, is the person, the laborer who is directly working upon it. They're the ones who can figure out what more the thing might be able to yield. So we go on. He says, the negative relation to the object becomes its form and something permanent. The fact that the slave has to engage with the object at first seems to be something negative. They're not deriving any benefit from it, the master is. But actually the slave is continuing to develop, and to develop in relation to the objects they work upon. He says, it is precisely for the worker that the object has independence. It's only through engaging with the tough stuff, with the things that are recalcitrant, the things that can't be neatly dealt with in a tutorial video that'll get you right through it, that allows a person to truly understand what they're dealing with, the phenomena. It's the same way with philosophy. If you're going to study texts, it's great that I, provide these YouTube videos, but that's not the same thing as actually you doing the work of reading the text and trying to make sense of it, aided by the things that I'm providing you with, and hopefully other people as well, right? But you doing the labor, you engaging the text. And when we have you write papers, now, granted, if I'm making students write papers, one of the worst things about being a professor is grading. So it's not like I'm really getting the wonderful stuff and you're getting the hard stuff that you have to, crack your head on. But it probably feels that way quite often as you're writing it. We could go on and on and on with all sorts of other examples. One of my favorite examples of this sort of thing has to do with relationships in the workplace, particularly academic workplaces, but really any sort of workplace. I'm always, and I've mentioned this in other videos, I'm always really good to secretaries. Why? Because the secretaries are the ones who actually make things happen in offices. They're usually the ones, not the boss, usually not even the office manager. The secretaries are the ones who know where everything is, who controls the information, how to connect up with other people on campus or in the organization to get things done. They are the ones who make things work because they have to. They're usually in a subordinate position. They're usually underappreciated, even if they get flowers on Secretary's Day or something like that. Even if they get a great title, they're no longer a secretary but an administrative assistant or something like that. When you're the go-between for another person who is your boss and the world of reality, the world of things that do not conform to our desires and have to be shaped in order to satisfy the desires of somebody else, you end up learning an awful lot about that world, or you shipwreck and drown. And then you find another job, right? Being a secretary wasn't for you. The people who thrive in those sort of circumstances, my mother was one of them. And that's where I learned this from. But I've encountered other people who do as well. They are the ones who end up taking that as their domain and their challenge. And they end up becoming sort of like a different kind of master. The person who you really need to go to if you want to get things accomplished. I could tell you more about that, but I don't want to get too far off track. You see how that fits in here, though. So he goes on and he says, It's precisely for the worker the object has independence. This negative middle term, or the formative activity, is at the same time the individuality. Through formative activity, through working upon the thing, the worker develops individuality in a way that most likely escapes the gaze of the master. And doesn't get, this is a good point too. History, we say, is written by the victors. Not always completely true, but very often true. History is also, for the most part, written by the classes that are literate. Also very important. But history is also generally written in such a way as to take account of what the people who are in charge, the people who have authority, the people who have privilege, the people who have power, are interested in knowing about and communicating about. It's quite natural. There are many things within history, and we've gotten better about recovering this sort of thing with what we call cultural history or social history. There's economic history. Recovering the realm of what we might call the in-between here, of the marginalized or the ones who really are getting things done. And we with history, we're not getting an awful lot of individuality. We have to do a lot of imagining for that. But if we think about history not just as a discipline, not just as a bunch of documents or something like that, but we think about history in its being as the way human beings have been, there have been countless individuals who we will never know, who may not even have fully understood themselves as individuals, but again, like I said, who ended up escaping the gaze of the masters or the attention of the masters, and were engaged with the world of things, and who had, thoughts of their own, insights, realizations, communications back and forth, private jokes, this entire realm that is a realm of objectivity and permanence. So he says, this negative middle term, the formative activity, is at the same time the individuality or pure being for self of consciousness, which now in the work outside of it. Now notice what happens. Work is something that is being done. Work now becomes the activity itself of the doing, and thereby work becomes the object as the work, the thing that has been accomplished. It's been externalized from being something that was an activity of the person. It becomes a relation to the thing, and then becomes the transformed thing. A transformed world that the worker can know more thoroughly than the master can, because they're the ones who made that world, or at least made that part of the world. So he says, it is in this way, therefore, that consciousness, as worker, comes to see in the independent thing of the object its own independence. So the servant is still a servant, but they are also at the same time an independent being.